The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Shadows stretched long across the sidewalks, and the air carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass. It was the kind of place where people waved to each other as they passed by, where children played outside until the streetlights flickered on, and where life moved at a slow, predictable pace. Harold Jensen lived alone in a small house at the end of Maple Street. His home wasn't much to look at, just a modest brick building with peeling paint around the window frames, but it was his sanctuary. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs of happier times. Harold standing proudly in his army uniform, surrounded by friends, Harold dancing with his wife at their wedding, Harold holding his newborn daughter for the first time. Those memories were all he had left now. His wife had passed away years ago, and his daughter lived far away, visiting only once or twice a year. At 91, Harold's body didn't move as quickly as it used to. His steps were slow and deliberate, his hands often trembled, and his back bent slightly forward. But his mind remained sharp, filled with vivid recollections of battles fought and friendships forged during World War II. He spent most of his days tending to his garden, pulling weeds and watering flowers, finding solace in the simple act of nurturing life. Neighbors often commented on how beautiful his garden looked, but Harold never sought praise. For him, it was just something to keep him busy, something to give his days meaning. That evening, Harold decided to take a short walk to the local grocery store. He needed a few essentials, bread, milk, and some fresh fruit, and thought the exercise would do him good. He grabbed his cane, slipped on his old jacket, and headed out the door. As he walked down the sidewalk, he nodded politely to the people he passed. Some smiled back while others barely noticed him. Harold didn't mind. He was used to being invisible, blending into the background like an old photograph tucked away in a drawer. The grocery store was only a 10-minute walk from his house, but it felt longer to Harold. By the time he reached the checkout counter, his legs ached, and he leaned heavily on his cane. Still, he paid for his items without complaint, carefully placing them into a reusable bag. On his way out, he stopped to admire the display of pumpkins near the entrance. Fall was his favorite season, and he loved seeing the bright orange gourds stacked high, ready for Halloween decorations. As Harold made his way back home, the sky grew darker, and the temperature dropped slightly. The streets were quieter now, with fewer people out and about. He turned onto Maple Street, his pace slowing even more as fatigue set in. Just as he approached the lamppost near his house, 3 figures emerged from the shadows. They were young men, probably in their early 20s, dressed in dark clothes and hoodies pulled low over their faces. One of them held a cigarette between his fingers, the tip glowing red in the dim light. "Well, what do we have here?" one of the men said, stepping closer. His voice was mocking, dripping with disdain. Harold recognized him immediately. Jason, a troublemaker who'd been causing problems in the neighborhood for months. Jason was tall and lanky, with a scruffy beard and piercing eyes that seemed to bore into Harold's soul. Harold tightened his grip on the grocery bag and tried to keep walking, hoping they would leave him alone, but another man blocked his path, spreading his arms wide. "Where you going, old-timer?" he sneered. This one was shorter and stockier, with tattoos peeking out from under his sleeves. His name was Kyle, and he had a reputation for picking fights at the local bar. The third man hung back, leaning against the lamppost with a smirk on his face. His name was Marcus, and though he didn't say anything, his presence added to the tension in the air. Harold felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew this wasn't going to end well. "Come on, Grandpa," Jason said, circling Harold like a predator sizing up its prey. "You got any cash on you? Maybe some change for us?" Harold shook his head firmly. "I don't carry money," he replied, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. "Leave me alone." Jason laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the empty street. "You hear that, boys? He thinks he can tell us what to do." He stepped closer, invading Harold's personal space. "We're not asking nicely anymore. Hand it over or else." Harold stood his ground, gripping his cane tightly. He wasn't about to let these punks intimidate him, no matter how scared he felt. "I fought in a war," he said, his tone firm. "I'm not afraid of bullies like you." For a moment there was silence. Then Kyle snorted. "Oh yeah? What war was that, Pops? Vietnam? Korea?" He exchanged glances with Jason, who grinned wickedly. "No," Harold said, his voice rising slightly. "World War II. I served my country, when you boys weren't even born yet. And I'll be damned if I let scum like you push me around." The thugs exchanged amused looks, clearly unimpressed by Harold's words. Marcus finally spoke up, his voice cold and cruel. Big talk for someone who can barely stand upright. Before Harold could respond, Jason shoved him roughly against the lamppost. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and the grocery bag fell to the ground, spilling its contents onto the pavement. Bread rolled away and a carton of milk tipped over, leaking onto the concrete. Harold struggled to catch his breath, clutching his cane for support. Across the street, unnoticed by the group, Rachel Monroe sat quietly on her porch. She had been enjoying a cup of tea, watching the last rays of sunlight fade away, when she saw the commotion unfolding. At first glance, Rachel appeared to be just another neighbor, a friendly, unassuming woman in her late 30s with shoulder-length brown hair and a warm smile. But beneath that exterior lay years of rigorous training and experience as a member of the Royal Guard. Rachel observed the scene with growing concern. She recognized the three men. They were known troublemakers, always causing chaos in the area. Her instincts told her to intervene, but she hesitated, weighing her options. If she revealed herself too soon, she risked blowing her cover. Yet, as she watched Jason raise his fist, preparing to strike Harold, Rachel knew she couldn't stand idly by. Setting her teacup down on the railing, Rachel rose to her feet. Her movements were calm and measured, belying the storm of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She crossed the street, her eyes fixed on the group. As she drew closer, she called out softly, "Is everything all right here?" Jason turned toward her, his expression shifting from anger to annoyance. "Mind your own business, lady," he snapped, waving her off dismissively. Rachel didn't flinch. Instead, she took another step forward, her gaze steady. Something in her demeanor made the thugs pause, their bravado faltering ever so slightly. Little did they know, they were about to learn a valuable lesson about underestimating someone based on appearances. Rachel's voice cut through the tension like a knife slicing through fog. "Is everything all right here?" she repeated, her tone soft yet firm. Her presence seemed to disrupt the dynamics of the situation, forcing the thugs to turn their attention away from Harold momentarily. Jason, the tallest of the three, sneered at her. "I said mind your own business, lady," he growled, his voice laced with irritation. He took a step toward Rachel, trying to intimidate her with his height and build. But Rachel didn't flinch. Instead, she met his gaze head-on, her brown eyes steady and unyielding. Kyle, the shorter and stockier one, exchanged a glance with Marcus, who still leaned casually against the lamppost. They both chuckled nervously, unsure how to handle this unexpected interruption. "What's it to you, huh?" Kyle asked, crossing his arms over his chest. His attempt to sound tough fell flat when Rachel simply raised an eyebrow, her demeanor calm and composed. Harold, meanwhile, clutched his cane tightly, using it to steady himself as he tried to catch his breath. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was something about Rachel's presence that gave him a flicker of hope. She didn't look particularly strong or imposing. In fact, she looked like any other neighbor, but there was an air of authority about her that made even the thugs hesitate. Rachel ignored Jason's threatening posture and focused instead on Harold. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked gently, her voice filled with genuine concern. Harold nodded weakly, though his trembling hands betrayed his fear. Without waiting for permission, Rachel moved closer, positioning herself between Harold and the thugs. It was a subtle shift, but it sent a clear message. She wasn't backing down. Jason's patience wore thin. "You really don't want to get involved in this," he warned, jabbing a finger in Rachel's direction. His tone was harsh, meant to scare her off, but Rachel didn't react the way he expected. Instead, she smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of her lips, and tilted her head slightly. "You're right," she said smoothly. I probably shouldn't get involved. For a brief moment, Jason relaxed, thinking she might actually leave. Then Rachel added, "But I'm going to anyway." Before anyone could react, Rachel sprang into action. Years of training kicked in, transforming her from a seemingly harmless bystander into a force to be reckoned with. In one fluid motion, she grabbed Kyle's wrist, the hand holding the knife, and twisted it sharply. The blade clattered to the ground and Kyle yelped in pain, dropping to his knees. Marcus lunged forward, attempting to grab Rachel from behind, but she anticipated his move, sidestepping effortlessly and delivering a swift kick to his shin. The impact sent him stumbling backward, crashing into the lamppost with a loud thud. By now, Jason had recovered from his shock and charged at Rachel, his fists raised. Rachel ducked under his wild swing, pivoting gracefully to avoid another clumsy punch. Using his momentum against him, she grabbed his arm and pulled him downward, slamming his shoulder hard onto the pavement. Jason cried out, clutching his injured limb as he struggled to sit up. Within seconds, all three men were incapacitated, groaning in pain and unable to fight back. Rachel stood tall amidst the chaos, her breathing controlled and her expression unreadable. She glanced briefly at Harold, who stared at her in stunned silence. Then, without missing a beat, she bent down to retrieve the fallen knife, tucking it safely into her pocket. The entire confrontation lasted less than a minute, but it felt like hours to Harold. He watched in awe as Rachel single-handedly dismantled the group of thugs, her movements precise and efficient. When the dust settled, the only sounds were the distant hum of crickets and the labored breathing of the defeated men. "Stay down," Rachel ordered, her voice cold and commanding. The thugs obeyed without question, too terrified to argue. Satisfied that they posed no further threat, Rachel turned her attention back to Harold. She approached him slowly, careful not to startle him. "Are you hurt?" she asked, kneeling beside him. Her voice was softer now, filled with warmth and reassurance. Harold shook his head, though his hand still trembled slightly. No, I'm fine," he managed to say, his voice shaky. Thank you so much." Rachel offered him a reassuring smile. "It's okay," she said. "You're safe now." She helped him to his feet, steadying him as he regained his balance. Once she was certain Harold was stable, she bent down to gather the spilled groceries. The bread was slightly squished and the milk carton had leaked everywhere, but Rachel salvaged what she could, placing the items back into the reusable bag. As she worked, Harold studied her face, searching for answers. Who was this woman? How had she taken down 3 grown men so easily? And why did she seem so unfazed by what had just happened? Before he could ask, Rachel spoke again. "Do you live nearby?" she asked, nodding toward the houses lining the street. Harold pointed to a modest brick house at the end of the block. "Yes, just over there," he replied, "number 24. Rachel nodded. "Let me walk you home," she said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Harold didn't protest. Despite his pride, he knew he needed the support. Together they began the short journey to his house, leaving the thugs sprawled on the sidewalk behind them. As they walked, Harold couldn't help but marvel at Rachel's composure. She carried herself with confidence, her every step deliberate and measured. There was an aura of mystery about her, a sense that she was more than she appeared to be. He wanted to ask her questions to understand how someone so ordinary-looking could possess such extraordinary skills, but he held his tongue, sensing that she wouldn't welcome prying. When they reached Harold's front door, Rachel handed him the grocery bag and waited patiently while he unlocked the door. Once inside, she followed him to the kitchen, insisting on helping him put away the few items he'd managed to save. As she placed the bread on the counter, Harold finally found the courage to speak. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If you hadn't shown up—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Rachel turned to face him, her expression kind but guarded. "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. "I couldn't stand by and do nothing." Harold hesitated, then asked the question that had been weighing on his mind. "Who are you, really?" Rachel paused, considering her response. She couldn't reveal the full truth, not yet, but she owed him some explanation. "Let's just say, I've had training," she said carefully, "and I believe in standing up for those who can't defend themselves." Her words sparked a memory in Harold's mind. He thought back to his days in the military, to the camaraderie and shared purpose he'd experienced during the war. Though decades separated them, he felt a strange connection to Rachel, as if they were kindred spirits bound by a common thread of duty and honor. "Well, I'm grateful," Harold said sincerely. "More than I can say." Rachel nodded, a hint of sadness flickering in her eyes. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Jensen," she said, heading toward the door. "And don't hesitate to call if you ever need help again." With that, she stepped outside, closing the door gently behind her. Harold stood in the doorway, watching as she crossed the street and disappeared into the shadows. For the first time in years, he felt a renewed sense of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, heroes could emerge when you least expected them. The next morning, Harold woke up feeling lighter than he had in years. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind like a vivid dream. The thugs, their cruel taunts, the fear that gripped him. And then Rachel stepping in, her quiet strength turning the tide. He couldn't shake the image of her standing tall amidst the chaos, her movements precise and controlled. Who was she? What kind of life had led her to possess such skills? And why did she seem so determined to protect him? Harold decided to find out. After breakfast, he made a pot of tea and waited. He didn't have to wait long. By mid-morning, there was a soft knock at his door. When he opened it, Rachel stood there, wearing jeans and a casual sweater. She smiled warmly, holding a small bouquet of flowers in one hand. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said, her voice gentle. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing." Harold stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. "Not at all," he replied. "Please come in. I was just thinking about you." Rachel entered the house, glancing around curiously. The interior was modest but welcoming, with faded furniture and shelves lined with books and photographs. She noticed a framed picture of Harold in uniform on the mantel and paused to study it. "You were in the army?" she asked, pointing to the photo. Harold nodded, pride flickering in his eyes. "World War II, he said. "It was a long time ago, but some days it feels like yesterday." Rachel studied the photograph for a moment longer, then turned back to Harold. "You must have seen a lot," she said thoughtfully. "I did," Harold admitted, "and I've carried those memories with me ever since. But enough about me. What about you? Last night wasn't exactly ordinary." Rachel chuckled softly, though there was a hint of tension in her smile. "No, it wasn't," she agreed. She followed Harold into the living room, where he gestured for her to sit. He poured her a cup of tea and placed it on the small table. Between them, "I owe you an explanation," Rachel began, choosing her words carefully. "But I need you to understand that I can't tell you everything. Some things are better left unsaid." Harold nodded slowly, sipping his tea. "Fair enough," he said. "Just tell me what you can." Rachel took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I served in the military," she said finally. "For many years I worked in security, protecting people, handling dangerous situations. It's a job that requires certain skills." She hesitated, then added, "Sometimes, even when you're not officially on duty, you can't ignore someone in trouble. That's why I stepped in last night." Harold listened intently, piecing together the fragments of her story. He didn't press for details, sensing that she was being as open as she could be. Still, her words raised more questions than answers. Why had she chosen this quiet neighborhood to live in? Was she hiding from something or someone? "Do you work alone now?" Harold asked cautiously. Rachel shook her head. "Not exactly," she said. "I'm part of a team. We handle special assignments, things most people never hear about. Right now, I'm recovering, taking some time away from the field." She glanced at Harold, her expression softening. This place seemed like a good spot to lay low for a while. Harold nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. Well, I'm glad you're here, he said sincerely. You saved my life last night, Rachel. I won't forget that. Rachel smiled faintly, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of sadness. You don't owe me anything, Mr. Jensen. Just promise me you'll take care of yourself. These streets aren't always safe, even in a neighborhood like this. They spent the next hour talking, sharing stories from their lives. Harold told her about his wife, Margaret, and how she'd passed away after a long illness. He spoke of his daughter, Emily, who lived in another state and visited only occasionally. Rachel listened quietly, nodding occasionally, her expression thoughtful. In turn, Rachel shared bits and pieces of her own story. She talked about growing up in a small town, joining the military at 18 and discovering a passion for protecting others. Though she avoided specifics about her missions, she described the challenges of balancing her dangerous career with a desire for normalcy. It's hard sometimes, she admitted. Living two lives, one where you're constantly on alert, and another where you try to blend in and be ordinary. I guess I've never been very good at blending in. Harold chuckled softly. Seems to me you blend in pretty well, he said. Until you don't. Rachel laughed, the sound warm and genuine. For the first time since arriving in the neighborhood, she felt a sense of peace, a connection to someone who understood, at least in part, the weight of carrying secrets. As the afternoon wore on, Rachel helped Harold tidy up the house. She swept the floors, dusted the shelves, and even tended to his garden, pulling weeds and watering the plants. Harold protested at first, insisting he could manage on his own, but Rachel waved him off. It's the least I can do, she said. Besides, I enjoy it. Gardening reminds me of home. By the time evening fell, Harold felt a renewed sense of gratitude, not just for Rachel's bravery, but for her kindness. She wasn't just a protector. She was a friend, someone who cared without expecting anything in return. Before leaving, Rachel promised to visit again soon. If you need anything at all, you call me, she said firmly. Day or night, I'll be here. Harold nodded, touched by her sincerity. Thank you, Rachel, he said, for everything. As she walked back across the street to her own house, Rachel reflected on the day. Helping Harold had reminded her of why she'd chosen this path in the first place, to make a difference no matter how small. In a world filled with darkness, moments like these were rare and precious. Unbeknownst to both of them, their friendship was only beginning. Over the weeks that followed, Rachel became a regular presence in Harold's life. She brought him groceries, fixed things around the house, and listened patiently as he recounted tales from his past. In return, Harold offered her wisdom and perspective, helping her navigate the emotional scars of her own experiences. Together, they formed an unlikely bond, a retired veteran and a covert operative, united by a shared sense of duty and humanity. And though neither of them knew what the future held, they faced it with courage, knowing they weren't alone. Weeks passed, and Harold's life began to change in small but meaningful ways. Rachel visited him regularly, bringing not just her help but also companionship. At first, their interactions were practical. She fixed the leaky faucet in his kitchen, replaced a broken light bulb, and helped him organize his cluttered garage. But over time, their conversations grew deeper, revealing layers of trust and understanding neither had expected. Harold found himself looking forward to Rachel's visits. She had a way of making even the simplest tasks feel special. When she worked in his garden, for example, she didn't just pull weeds or water the plants. She talked about them as if they were old friends, sharing interesting facts about each flower and herb. Did you know lavender can help you sleep better? She said one day, pointing to a patch of purple blooms near the fence. And marigolds keep pests away. They're like nature's bodyguards. Harold chuckled, leaning back on his bench as he watched her work. You've got quite the green thumb, he remarked. Margaret used to love gardening too. I never picked it up myself, though. Rachel glanced at him, smiling. Well, maybe it's time you tried, she suggested. Gardening's good for the soul. Plus, it gets you outside breathing fresh air. Harold hesitated, then nodded slowly. Maybe you're right, he said. Teach me something easy to start with. From that day on, Rachel made sure to include Harold in her gardening projects. She showed him how to plant seeds, prune bushes, and care for delicate flowers. Though his hands shook and his movements were slow, Harold threw himself into the work with surprising enthusiasm. He discovered that tending to the garden gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. It was comforting, in a way, to nurture something that grew steadily despite the challenges of weather and time. Their bond deepened with every shared moment. Harold loved hearing about Rachel's adventures, even the vague stories she allowed herself to tell. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch sipping lemonade, Harold asked, "What made you choose this line of work?" "Protecting people. Rachel paused, considering her answer. "I guess it started when I was a kid," she said finally. "My dad was a police officer. He always talked about serving the community, helping those who couldn't help themselves. I admired that about him. When I joined the military, I realized I wanted to do more than follow orders. I wanted to make a real difference." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "That takes guts," he said. "Not everyone has the courage to put themselves in harm's way like that." "It's not just courage," Rachel replied softly. "Sometimes it's fear too, the fear of standing by and doing nothing. That's what drives me, I think, knowing I can step in when someone needs help." Her words resonated deeply with Harold. He thought back to his own days in the army, the camaraderie and sense of duty that had defined his youth. Though their circumstances were different, he recognized the same spirit in Rachel, a commitment to protecting others, no matter the cost. In return, Harold shared stories from his past, painting vivid pictures of life during wartime. He told Rachel about the freezing winters in Europe, the bonds he'd formed with his fellow soldiers, and the bittersweet joy of returning home after the war ended. "We didn't have much back then," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "But we had each other. That meant everything." Rachel listened intently, captivated by his tales. She admired the resilience and humility in Harold's voice, qualities she rarely encountered in her line of work. In many ways, he reminded her of the mentors she'd looked up to during her training, people who led by example rather than through grand gestures. As their friendship blossomed, so did the neighborhood's curiosity. Neighbors noticed Rachel, spending more time at Harold's house, and began speculating about their relationship. Some assumed she was his granddaughter, others thought she might be a caregiver. No one guessed the truth, that beneath Rachel's calm exterior lay a highly trained operative capable of extraordinary feats. One evening, as Rachel watered the garden, a neighbor stopped by to chat. Mrs. Peterson, a chatty woman in her 60s, leaned over the fence and called out, "You two seem awfully close these days." "Are you related?" Rachel smiled politely. "No, ma'am," she replied. "Just helping out a friend." Mrs. Peterson raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Well, it's nice to see Harold with some company. He's such a sweet man. We all worry about him being alone." Rachel nodded, her expression softening. "He's a remarkable person," she agreed. "I'm lucky to know him." When Harold heard about the encounter later, he laughed. "They think you're my granddaughter now," he teased. "Should I tell them otherwise?" Rachel shrugged, grinning. "Let them believe what they want," she said. "It keeps things simple." Despite the growing rumors, Rachel remained cautious about revealing too much about herself. She knew her presence in the neighborhood was temporary, a brief respite before she returned to her duties. Still, she cherished the time she spent with Harold, finding solace in their quiet moments together. One Saturday morning, Rachel arrived at Harold's house with a surprise. She carried a small potted plant wrapped in brown paper, its leaves glossy and green. "This is for you," she said, handing it to him. "It's an olive tree. They symbolize peace and resilience." Harold accepted the gift, his eyes misting slightly. "Thank you, Rachel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll take good care of it. Rachel smiled, her heart swelling with affection. She realized that, in helping Harold, she had also found healing for herself. His wisdom and kindness reminded her of the values she held dear, values that sometimes felt buried under the weight of her dangerous career. As the weeks turned into months, their routines became a source of comfort for both of them. On sunny afternoons, they worked side by side in the garden, chatting about everything from history to current events. On rainy days, they stayed indoors, playing cards or reading books aloud to each other. Harold introduced Rachel to classic novels he'd loved as a young man, while Rachel recommended modern authors whose works explored themes of courage and sacrifice. Through it all, their friendship continued to grow, rooted in mutual respect and admiration. Harold often reflected on how fortunate he was to have met Rachel, while Rachel found herself grateful for the stability and warmth Harold brought to her life. Together, they proved that heroism wasn't always about grand acts. It could also be found in the quiet everyday moments of connection and care. As autumn arrived, the neighborhood transformed into a tapestry of reds, oranges, and yellows. Leaves crunched underfoot, and the crisp air carried the faint scent of wood smoke. For Harold and Rachel, the changing season marked not just the passage of time, but also the deepening of their friendship. What had begun as an unexpected encounter had blossomed into something neither of them could have predicted, a bond that brought meaning and joy to both their lives. Harold's days were brighter now, filled with purpose and laughter. He no longer felt invisible like a relic of a bygone era. Instead, he found himself valued, not for what he'd done in the past, but for who he was in the present. Rachel treated him with respect and kindness, listening to his stories and seeking his advice. She often joked that he was teaching her more than she was teaching him, though Harold dismissed the idea with a wave of his hand. "You're the one showing me how to live again," he said one evening as they sat together on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. "I was just existing before you came along." Rachel smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "We're helping each other," she replied softly. "That's what friends do." Their connection wasn't limited to shared tasks or conversations. It extended to moments of quiet companionship, where words weren't necessary. On chilly mornings, they sipped coffee side by side, wrapped in blankets as they watched the world wake up. On clear nights, they stargazed, pointing out constellations and sharing stories about the myths behind them. Harold marveled at Rachel's knowledge of the stars, while Rachel admired his ability to find beauty in even the smallest details. Despite the warmth of these moments, Rachel knew her time in the neighborhood was limited. Her recovery period was nearing its end, and soon she would be called back to duty. The thought weighed heavily on her, though she tried not to let it show. Leaving Harold wouldn't be easy. He had become more than just a neighbor. He was family. One afternoon, as they worked in the garden, Rachel decided it was time to broach the subject. "Harold," she began hesitantly, brushing dirt from her gloves, "there's something I need to tell you." Harold paused, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What is it?" he asked, leaning on his cane. Rachel took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I won't be here forever," she said gently. "My work, it calls me away sometimes, and when that happens, I'll have to leave." Harold nodded slowly, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of sadness. "I figured as much," he admitted. "You've always been honest about that. But I'll miss you, Rachel." "I'll miss you too," Rachel said, her voice thick with emotion. "But this isn't goodbye. Not really. No matter where I go, you'll always be in my thoughts. And if you ever need me, all you have to do is call." Harold smiled faintly, touched by her promise. "You've already done so much for me," he said. "More than I deserved." "Don't say that," Rachel replied firmly. "You deserve every bit of happiness and peace. You've earned it." They spent the rest of the afternoon planting bulbs for spring flowers, focusing on the task at hand rather than the looming separation. As they worked, Harold reflected on the impact Rachel had made on his life. She hadn't just protected him from danger. She had reminded him of his worth, reigniting a spark he thought had long since faded. The weeks passed quickly, and before they knew it, Rachel received the message she'd been dreading. Her handler contacted her through a secure line, informing her that her assignment was ready. It was time to return to the field. On her last day in the neighborhood, Rachel packed her belongings quietly, ensuring she left no trace of her true identity behind. When she finished, she walked across the street to Harold's house carrying a small box wrapped in brown paper. "I brought you something," she said, handing it to him, "to remember me by." Harold opened the box carefully, revealing a framed photograph of the two of them standing in his garden, surrounded by blooming flowers. Rachel must have taken it secretly, capturing a candid moment of laughter and joy. Beneath the photo was a handwritten note. "Thank you for reminding me why we fight. Rachel." Tears welled up in Harold's eyes as he looked at the gift. "I'll treasure this," he said, his voice trembling. "And I'll take care of the garden. You taught me well." Rachel hugged him tightly, holding back her own tears. "Stay strong, Harold," she whispered. "Keep fighting the good fight." When Rachel finally left, the neighborhood noticed her absence immediately. Neighbors speculated about where she had gone, but Harold simply smiled and said, "She had somewhere important to be." He didn't elaborate, knowing that some secrets were meant to be kept. In the months that followed, Harold continued tending to the garden, nurturing the plants Rachel had helped him grow. Each bloom served as a reminder of her kindness and courage. Though he missed her dearly, he took comfort in knowing that she was out there, protecting others in ways most people would never understand. One sunny afternoon, as Harold sat on his porch admiring the vibrant colors of the garden, he spotted a familiar figure walking down the street. At first he thought it was his imagination, until the woman stepped closer, revealing Rachel's warm smile. "I told you I'd come back," she said, laughing at his shocked expression. "Did you think I'd forget about my favorite gardener?" Harold stood up slowly, his heart racing with joy. "Rachel," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "what are you doing here?" "I got a little time off," she explained. "Thought I'd check in on you, and maybe steal a cup of tea." They spent the rest of the day catching up, sharing stories and laughter as if no time had passed. For Harold, Rachel's return was proof that heroes don't disappear. They stay in your heart, ready to reappear when you least expect it. The sun set, casting a golden glow over the garden. Harold realized something important. Life might throw challenges your way, but it also brings unexpected blessings. Sometimes those blessings come in the form of a stranger who becomes a friend, or even a hero. And sometimes those heroes live right next door,